Hey everyone, this is Benjamin, and in this video we're going to talk about the question of should Christians go out and kill, I guess, anyone who commits abortion, because most Christians believe that abortion is murder of babies. So I mean, if that's not murder, then that's not a terrible offense. Then what isn't? So, and then you've also got the question of Christians also support capital punishment for murder. So should Christians go do something about people committing abortion? Let's just, and in the past it has happened, although it's been a while. So that's one thing people talk about. A lot of times this question of abortion bombings and abortion clinic attacks and that kind of thing. It's a domestic. It's here I'm at the Wikipedia page, anti-abortion violence. It's considered a current domestic terrorist threat by the United States Department of Justice. Most documented incidents have occurred within the United States, though also they have occurred in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. It's called single-issue terrorism, according to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Sub-revolutionary. So I don't know when's the last time it even happened. There were some attempted murders in '98. There were bombings in '96 and '98. Okay. There was an attack in 2009. It's called Christian terrorism. So yeah, this is an issue, for some, I guess. Let's look at some of the in Australia. Oh, at 2009, that was in Australia. It says faulty. They used Molotov cocktails, and faulty construction of the bombs limited damage to a single external burnt area, though if successful, damage would have been severe. It is believed that the individuals who made the attack were responsible for graffiti that said "baby killers" on the site, indicating an anti-abortion reason for the attack. No duh. That seems to be the most recent one. Another one in Australia in 2001. A security guard named Stephen Rogers, just like Captain America. He was shot in the chest and killed. And then he brought ropes and gags into the clinic with 16 liters of kerosene to burn all the staff and 26 patients to death. He was charged and sentenced with life in prison in 2002. In Canada, we've got different attacks: 94, 95, 97, July 2000. July 2000, they're not sure. It just says one of the doctors was stabbed by an unidentified assailant in the lobby of his clinic. New Zealand in 1976 and 1999. This is just the Wikipedia page. All right, here's the U.S. Here's 2015. That's the most recent one. In November 29, 2015, a shooting at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado, left 3 dead and several injured, and the suspect, Robert L. Deere, was apprehended. The suspect had previously acted against other clinics and referred to himself as a warrior for the babies at his hearing. Neighbors and former neighbors described the suspect as reclusive, and police from several states where the suspect resided described a history of run-ins dating from at least 1997. As of December 2015, the trial of the suspect was open, But on May 11, 2016, the court declared the suspect incompetent to stand trial. So they saying he's a nut. 2009, Dr. George Tiller was shot and killed by Scott Roeder. Tiller served as an usher at a church in Wichita, Kansas. It was not Tiller's first time being a victim to anti-abortion violence. He was shot once before in 1993 by Shelley Shannon, who was sentenced 10 years in prison for the shooting. Huh. So yeah, I wonder. Let's just look at someone like Scott Roeder. We can click on him. His first degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault. Okay. In a telephone call from prison, Roeder confessed to the press that he had shot and killed Tiller and declared that he felt no remorse. He's a member of an anti-government Montana Freeman group. Okay. Who is his wife? His wife, Lindsay, they were married in 1986 and were together for 10 years. Oh, he had explosives in 2009, but he never got to blow up the clinic. It was an attempted bombing. Okay, this will be relevant. On June 2nd, 2009, Lindsay Roeder gave an interview to Anderson Cooper of CNN about when and why her husband became radicalized. It was about 91, 92 when he basically couldn't cope with everyday life. He couldn't make ends meet, he couldn't pay the bills, and didn't know why he couldn't do that. And someone told him that if he didn't pay his federal taxes, if those taxes were left in his check, he could make ends meet. And then he started investigating that, and someone told him that it wasn't ratified properly in the Constitution, that it was illegal, his taxes. And he went from there and got into the anti-government, got into the militia, got into the Freeman, and along those lines, anti-abortion issues came up, and he started becoming very religious in the sense that he was reading the Bible. But then, after we were divorced, his religion took on a whole new right wing of himself. Okay. Wow, so these people are into it. The Army of God manual. And they call the killing of abortion providers would be something called justifiable homicide, according to David Leach, the publisher of Prayer and Action News. The Army of God manual advocates the killing of abortion providers. Told a reporter that Tiller's murder, speaking of Roeder, I know that he believed in justifiable homicide. Okay. Wow. They consider these people like Dr. Mengele of the concentration camps. You know, that's what they see abortion clinics as. Alright. Okay, so now it should be noted that various religious groups condemned what this guy did. So, like, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops condemned it. The Family Research Council, which would basically be a coalition of a lot of evangelical Christians, they condemned it. The American Jewish Congress condemned it. It's interesting because, like for example, you know, these groups are all anti-abortion groups. They condemn this. The National Right to Life Committee condemned it. Alright. Other groups here, I mean, they keep listing them. The anti-abortion militants, the Army of God, it promotes leader. They're like guerrilla warfare group about it. They consider the guy an American hero. It's just like, this is just about this one attack from this one guy. All right. So then, okay. Huh. Some people blamed Bill O'Reilly because he demonized the abortion doctors. Cenk Uygur from that show, The Young Turks, he argued that Bill O'Reilly is actually responsible for the abortion doctor's death. Okay, so hopefully that sets the stage for what we're going to talk about here. Maybe I took too long doing that, but whatever. So I think it's imperative on us as Christians to have a response to this, because this is the thing. We go around saying that abortion is murder and these people are killing babies, and then we don't go out and fight them. We don't go out and execute people who kill babies. We don't fight back. And it seems like the response is like, we don't really believe what we say we believe. Because if we really believed that these people were killing babies, we would fight, to the last breath, to the last inch of our lives to stop it from happening. So let's just look at this. Should Christians execute people who commit abortion? All right? Especially if they are people who support capital punishment. So, now first of all, we begin to ask ourselves, well, who should the mother be under the same punishment as the father? Well, clearly the crime would be different. So like you can't consider those two cases the same, The doctor is clearly more of a cold-blooded situation, while the mother is literally pregnant with this child. This is more of a heated situation for her. There's no way around it. So if you make a distinction between, first-degree murder and third-degree murder, then you would see that some sort of distinction would have to be made here. But the larger question is this. Is the abortion doctor, or the woman who gets the abortion, or whoever else might be involved, are they actually murderers? Are they actually murderers? In other words, if they do not believe that the fetus is a human child, then they're not murderers. Okay, so at least not according to the biblical sense. So let's give a little bit of background. In Genesis 9, it gives a biblical, from as far as I can tell, a biblical mandate that someone who commits murder should be executed. But it says, because they destroyed the image of God, then therefore they must be destroyed. They must be killed, or their blood must be spilled by a human. So, and the notion there in Genesis is like, it's one of where the world gets started. You have Adam and Eve in the garden, and shortly after the things fall apart in the garden, you have Cain and Abel in the first murder, and it talks about how murder is ramping up as you go into the stories of the next chapters. Evil and murder seems to be ramping up. I am a big fan of the gap theory, which relates to Genesis 5 and 11, that Genesis 5 and 11 have gaps between the people. And so actually, you may think that just a few generations pass from Adam to Abraham, but I think it could have been a very long period of time. Partly because if you don't think it's a very long period of time, you run into a problem where the people who were on the ark would have survived all the way to the time of Abraham. But then there's a guy in the middle of that period named Peleg, and it refers to, in his time, the world was divided. Well, it would have been all of their times, and so I don't have a big problem with saying that humans, began to exist on this planet 100,000 years ago, which is in the ballpark of what the science is telling us anyway. So, if that's the case, here's the point. That means that humans should have dispersed all over this planet pretty fast. The fact that that didn't happen means that it's a very good chance that there was a very, very high murder rate, which is what Genesis is talking about. And this whole deadly murder rate eventually crescendos into the biblical garden, the flood, where, so it says, God saw that every thought of humans was only evil continually. And so the biblical justification and so then the flood happens really to preserve the human race, because we're going to kill ourselves off. And he kills off everyone except the one guy he's not better than everyone else. He's not so bad, And it makes it clear in the text that, like, Noah's got some flaws and his family's got some flaws. They're not perfect, but they're like, at least his thoughts aren't only evil continually all the time. And so that goes into what comes right after the flood in Genesis 9, the biblical mandate for capital punishment. Is just that, you always want to see someone turn around. Anytime someone does something wrong, you want to see them come to repentance, come to renewal, come to atonement, come to be, washed and cleaned and, and renewed and revived and redeemed. And so the problem is, as far as this biblical mandate goes, if a person goes to the point of actually destroying the image of God, then they've just gone too far. And there has to be some sort of point where they've committed themselves and they've had the freedom to make up their mind about who they want to be inside, and that they can't just turn that off and switch that off and go back against that. And so, unless God intervenes somehow, you go based on this biblical mandate that, like, a person who commits murder has just made up their mind with who they want to be, and they're not gonna change it. As far as we know, unless God intervenes somehow. Given that God gives this command in Genesis 9. Now you may be asking me, well, like, what about the other commands later in the Old Testament, in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy? You see other commands, to execute people for all kinds of things, like engaging in witchcraft. You execute people for, like, I don't know if they have one for working on the Sabbath. I don't think they have that. People like to joke about that. I don't think they have that. But they have it. It's like 8 different things. For disobedient sons, though, that's one. It also has it for murder. So that may be confusing. Why am I taking the Old Testament seriously on this one command to execute murderers, but then I'm ignoring all this other stuff? So you might be bringing that up. And so I've talked about that in other videos, but the issue there is that we have to understand, Jesus makes it clear in, I think it's Matthew 19, where he talks about divorce. He refers to the Old Testament law, and he says that Moses permitted divorce because of your hardness of hearts, but it was not so from the beginning. In the beginning, God made them male and female. It is for this reason a man should leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And so the idea is, not everything that's allowed in the Old Testament is necessarily exactly the way God wanted things to go. That's what Jesus is making clear in Matthew 19. But he says, because of their hardness of hearts, he's permitting it, but it's not really what God wants. And so you got to understand, the Old Testament law was given to a different time and a different people, where, like, you know, in Babylon, the law code of Hammurabi said that, like, if I killed your daughter, then, like, I wouldn't be executed for that. Rather, I would have to give you a replacement daughter, one of my own, and it would have to be one of, like, equal quality. And if I killed your slave girl, then I would have to give you a slave girl, not my daughter, you know. And so, like, and in fact, in the Bronze Age, you know, it was normal for fathers to have the right to just kill their children, as they, you know, because children were seen as property of the father. In the Roman world, a baby was judged as soon as it was born, and it was quite normal for people to do what's called exposing of children. If the child seemed too weak, they would just leave it on the doorstep, and it would die, or unless somebody decided they wanted it. And if it was a deformed baby in the Greek and Roman world, then you were legally required to just kill it on the spot. And this judgment was made by the Father, and that's one of the things that's unique about Christians. You can read in if you read the early church father, one of the oldest Christian writings outside of the New Testament, dates to I think 130 A.D. It's called Mathetes. You might read it, and it looks like Mathetes. I think it's Mathetes to Diogenesis. I can't remember the name, but that's one of the things he brags about as what's unique about Christians. He says that they won't kill babies. You know, they preserve all babies. That was uniquely a Christian concept. So, like, which is kind of relevant to the whole abortion question. Christians have always been big on, you know, not killing babies. That's one of their defining characteristics. Although in the Greek and Roman world, it was often just you bring the pregnancy to term and then kill the baby. If you understand that, you understand that, like, the Old Testament law wasn't given to tell people exactly what to do. Rather, it's given to push people in a direction, in a positive direction. And what it did is, instead of coming in and just saying, okay, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, it came in and the saying is, it put the worm in the wood. And once the Old Testament put the worm in the wood, the house of the legal code of the way things have been was destined to crumble. Okay. But it was willing to be patient with people and push people in the proper direction. So one of the things the Old Testament did when it comes to these murder things, or these capital punishments for all these various things, what it did is it has like 8 things that you're supposed to execute people for. And then when it gets to murder, it says you execute people if they're murderers. And it says, now in this case, absolutely under no circumstances are you to let people off with a fine. Because the Old Testament had actually introduced fining people for crimes and you know, basically letting people off with fines for like all sorts of stuff that was like kind of a radical idea at the time. And then it has kind of this way of introducing that for every example except murder. But if you go back to the beginning, like Jesus says, or in this case back to the global flood, or the flood of Noah, you get actual biblical command that you're supposed to execute murderers. So the issue is, if a person isn't, and when it comes to abortion, like we said, do they believe that they're intentionally, are they intentionally destroying the image of God? Okay? And in fact, there's lots in the Old Testament law about unintentional killing, about how, you know, protections for people who, you know, unintentionally killed someone. Alright, now the problem is like, you know, like the Young Turks were saying, if you do keep pounding the drums of baby killers, then, and calling people, you know, abortion is murder, abortion is murder, abortion is murder, then this distinction gets forgotten. But it is an important distinction. These people who are, you know, aborting fetuses think that they're aborting just blobs of tissue. So they're not intentionally killing anyone. So this is more similar to involuntary manslaughter. You know what? Or really, you might think of it as voluntary manslaughter. I mean, they're doing it on purpose. It wasn't totally careless, but they just have no idea. And so what becomes important in the legal process is like, do these people who commit these murders, do they really believe that the fetus is not a person? Do they really believe that? And that's why we have a legal system and all that. You don't just kill people willy-nilly. You got to really investigate and make sure you know what you're doing before you execute someone or punish someone for something. Okay? So that's why, abortion is different from normal murder because it's rationalized by claiming that the baby is a fetus. Obviously, one has the question whether the murderers actually believe this or not. And that is important, because if not for some sort of way of, verifying that, then people could just go around and just willy-nilly just claim, like, you could just go kill people and claim, oh, well, I didn't think they were a person, so, I'm not a murderer, I'm off the hook. And that's not a fair defense, because you would have to make a case that they, defend that they actually believed it. So yeah. Now you may be asking, well, whether or not the Bible should be brought into the legal system, but that's kind of what we're asking here, is like, like these groups that are like anti-government groups, or like, taking the law into your own hands and like thinking the government is just so corrupt that you can't take it anymore. We're talking about over 1 million babies getting aborted every year. And then there's a distinction that has to be made between, even if it is murder, what type of murder it is. Like our law systems here in America make a distinction between, like sort of heat of the moment murder and then cold-blooded murder. And cold-blooded murder is punished more severely. I do think you can make a biblical case that rapists should be executed, because in some case laws there in the Old Testament, it makes a very strong comparison to what we would in our legal system call aggravated sexual assault. Actual forceful rape, where the woman is screaming for help and but there's no one. That kind of thing, like it makes a strong comparison of that to the case of murder. So it would seem that, that is every bit, so I think you can make a strong biblical case for executing murderers and rapists, but you can't make a strong biblical case. People anyone who tries to extrapolate it out from the other stuff is really just, not taking the Old Testament very seriously, or seriously enough, I guess. Which is a common liberal thing, they learn a little bit and feel like they know everything. Alright. Whereas, the Bible, for example, the Bible makes distinctions in rape. Like, it talks about one case where, like, a man begins to force himself on a woman, but then she consents. Like, well, that's very different from a man who forces himself on a woman against her consent. But it's still not totally innocent, because he was going, and so, like, in the Old Testament law, it has, like, a punishment for that. But it's not the same at all. It's not execution. All right. It was like he almost would have, committed it. All right. So, it does boil down to whether these people who commit abortion are murderers, or they really believe, that they're not murderers. Are they duped into believing this? Now, making that case can get tricky, but it's very similar to, like, you could say, well, like, what did the Nazis really believe about the Jews? What level did the Nazi propaganda, what level of believability did that really have? That's a difficult case to make, but that's why you have legal cases. But that distinction should be made. All right. But it does boil down to really what the general view of things are in the culture, in the society. That's really what it goes back to. All right. Now you could... Now that we've looked at capital punishment, let's look at a different question. Let's say that you are asked, this is the classic example of the just war theory. Maybe we should make war on these people, not to execute them or punish them, but rather just to stop this horrible thing from continuing to go on. And so that would be more similar to like the Nazis or something like that. Like, okay, like you can't just let, the Nazis continue with their, extermination of people. You've got to do something. And we're talking about 1 million babies a year that are executed, and so in 12 years they're going to equal the 12 million that the Nazis killed in way less years. But anyway, so like the classic example of just war theory is, let's say that a child is about to be killed, about to be murdered. Is it justified for you to use deadly force to prevent this? And I think, a powerful case can be made to say, yes, like you are justified to use deadly force. And the case I would make is just largely that there is no peaceful resistance. There is no nonviolent resistance. In other words, like, if you all you can do, if you're going to resist that person who wants to murder that child, is you can grab that child and hug it and say, like, over my dead body. In which case, you force them into a situation where they have to become violent and have to kill you. And so you're just manipulating more violence. And so it becomes, do what I want, or, or commit this other murder. And that's all you're really doing. You're forcing their options into do exactly what you want and don't kill anyone, or they have to commit this other murder of murdering you, or and that is that's really using violence to get what you want. The threat of violence. I'll force you, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm going to force you to also kill this other person. And so it's not really nonviolent resistance. Because it puts that ultimatum on people. And so the only way to be truly nonviolent is just to be totally non-resistant. And just to go along and be in total agreement with everything everyone says, You see that becomes a problem too, because like I guess you could just say, hey, stop, don't do that. But then if and you could just use your words and try to talk people into stopping, but you're not going to say like over my dead body and hug the child. The problem is like, well, that just leads to other absurdities. Like, so like, what if they want to make laws, or tell you, or not, maybe not even a law, just tell you that if you say anything, they'll kill you, and they'll kill the baby too. Well, if you just say something in that situation, then you're, again, you're manipulating violence and that sort of thing. And so the only response is total non-resistance, total compliance to what everyone says all the time, which is clearly not biblical, because the Bible says to go make disciples of all nations. And so you've got to be willing to, push people to change. It's just a question of like, what do you think are the right way of, going about it? And so my point is, if you can't make a good reason to draw a distinction between nonviolence, any one of those steps, then like why shouldn't we use why shouldn't violence be justified to prevent someone from doing something? So like, in other words, you can make a case. So like, for example, you can make a case about using the least amount of violence possible to stop bad things from happening. So like, maybe I can stop the guy who wants to murder their child without actually hurting anyone. We can always make a case for that, but that's not the relevant question. The relevant question is, what if that's just not an option? That's really, what if my best option is to use violence to stop this person, and perhaps even deadly violence? So that raises the whole question of, pacifism and all that. I guess that could become a huge rabbit trail. But yeah, I just don't see a justification for nonviolence. Essentially, because if you like tell them over my dead body and you hug the child, then you are using violence. So it's just a question of, is manipulating the person into killing someone they don't want to kill, is that morally better than killing them? Both of those seem pretty dark, honestly. And so, like, but if you're not, they're on an equal level, honestly. So like, if you're not willing to do either of those, then you run into total non-resistance, which is clearly wrong. And so you have to be willing to do one of those. And there's no real reason to say that one of those is more preferable to the other. Because one, like, you're trying to, and honestly, in one of them you're trying to corrupt the person. Or you're putting them on that ultimatum situation. Okay, you can't really make a case that the non-violent peaceful resistance is any better than the violent resistance, or morally superior. So what this means is, like, okay, well, people would say, well, why don't we just go make war on like guerrilla warfare, like that little, what is it, the little manual said, on abortion doctors and that kind of thing. Not in terms of capital punishment, but just in terms of violent resistance. Okay, so let's think about it. The issue is, like, Ravi Zacharias tells a story about a Dutch woman who is a social worker in Cambodia. And she talks about a place called Snake Alley where bad, debauched men come and, like, they drink a mixture of snake's blood and alcohol, and then they go do these, like, evil things. And she said that she had to rip a 18-month-old baby girl out of the arms of a man who was he was raping the child. And that situation, it may seem similar to abortion in the United States, but it's actually quite different, because as far as I understand, that you're not supposed to do that in Cambodia. Whereas in America, abortion is legal, it's the culture, it's the norm, it's the law of the land. So if you're not going to be fighting against just one guy doing, one criminal doing something bad, you're taking on the whole nation. And so if you go to, try to stop abortion, this is more similar to saying that, like, all right, the Nazis, are evil, and so I'm going to go take them down. And instead of waiting and organizing with all the other troops and, making our big invasion of Normandy on D-Day, forget that. I'm just going in now, because, every day that I wait, more people are dying. So I'm going in now well, you don't even have any weapons. Well, I've got my pocket knife. I'm good. I sharpened it up. I felt guilty for sharpening the knife because more people were dying. But I'm going in, Okay, so the problem with that kind of idea is, do you have any realistic hope of success there? That's what that boils down to, In other words, like, do any of these attacks that these guys have made to end abortion, have they had any success in ending abortion? No, like, it makes me think about those guys who just, like, burnt, some of a building. Like, that's not really doing anything. Like, they're just going to keep doing abortions, Did they really save any children from being killed with that? It's a very difficult case to make. Okay? It's when abortion is legal and normal in the culture and people really believe that it's not murder, you just don't have the force to take on the United States government, by yourself. Now, here's an alternative question. Why not raise an army? Yeah, kids are going to die on the way. children are going to be dying until you get the army raised. But by golly, this is, we're going to raise the army. And all right, so like, this sounds like a civil war, where like, okay, we're going to raise an army in this nation of all the people who oppose abortion, and we're going to fight a big civil war. So we had a civil war in this country, right? And the North and the South raised their armies, and they fought, and the North didn't originally fight to end slavery, but ultimately that's pretty much what happened. So why not fight a war to end abortion? The South didn't consider, many people in the South didn't consider blacks to be real people, and they justified slavery on that basis. So why not do something similar to end abortion? Just to end it. You don't want to like lock everyone up who's doing it if they really don't understand what's going on. But like, at least end this. Well, first, the problem is no such army exists. And see, that's the issue. If such an army did exist, then it would be more consistently popular and accepted in our culture to just ban abortion. Because if an army that could oppose the United States itself existed within the United States over the issue of ending abortion, then you could just like, if that case, you could just democratically end it, because ending abortion would be popular anyway, and you could do that. You could do it through democracy and sitting down at the table and agreeing. And we can see that a peaceful end to such a practice is preferable. Don't you think that we would have rather have ended slavery without going to war? Isn't that preferable? All right. Now that was part of the question even in the time of the Civil War, right? It's relevant because, like, that was the question. Lincoln said that he wanted a democratic end to slavery. He wanted, and when the South seceded, he said the only reason he was making war on the South was for the preservation of the Union, so that they could continue their democratic union of the states, and then that democratic union could end slavery. He made it clear the whole time, I'm not going to war to take away their slaves. But later on, as he got through the war, he realized this is a war about slavery, and he, did the Emancipation Proclamation. But it's important to understand that they all thought the war was going to be quick and that sort of thing. No one thought that it was going to be this horrifying war. And it appears that Lincoln came to realize this was God's punishment on the nation, or just the beginning of it, for the crime of slavery. And, so something like that, maybe something like that will happen to America. I don't know that the way God works is so simple, do bad and bad happens to you, although a lot of people like to say that, but I don't know that that's necessarily, this is God we're talking about. Who's to say that we understand why he does what he does? All right. Now, yeah, so we could talk about the Civil War. You could look at this in terms of, you could ask a further question about, like, other nations, too. Like, child prostitution does exist in Cambodia, as far as I've heard. So, like, should the United States go to war over this? And so that's just a similar situation to help us wrap our minds around it. That problem is really no different from the last question we asked about a civil war, because nations have allies, so you're not just making war against, one little nation, you're making war against them and all their allies. And so you've got to think about, like, is this a realistically winnable war? Who are you going to be going to war against? And so it makes more sense in America that we should try to persuade the nation to change its mind about abortion. Actually makes more sense. unless, you know, God speaks to you in a dream or something and tells you that, you know, you can do this, you know, like you're, you know, maybe you're like Moses and the burning bush comes and God's going to, like, you know, miraculously help you do this. You shouldn't assume that God's going to miraculously help you do something unless He is. And if He is, then no one can stop you. And if He isn't, then you're going to be stopped. So, I mean, in that case, it's up to you, like, whether or not you really think God spoke to you. But you better be right about that. Because God doesn't, you know, necessarily work that way all the time. God's plans, like I said, are more complicated. So, like, the world is filled with human rights violations, and abortion is just one of them. We have to allow God to move. We have to allow God to work according to His divine providence, His divine plan, no matter how little sense it makes to us. It's important to understand God is God and we are not. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. In other words, you are totally unlike anyone else. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Alright, so when Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer there, He's not talking about a military invasion of this world by God. He's talking about, He says in Luke 17, the kingdom of heaven is within you. That the invasion that God's going to make in this world, from Jesus' standpoint, is a spiritual invasion. It changes people's hearts and minds. That's what He's talking about the whole time. The kingdom of heaven is within you. So, I think that the biblical commands actually make a lot of sense, and it's remarkable when you think about it that, you know, these ancient laws actually make so much sense. And I think that if you're a Christian who just who thinks abortion is wrong, but you're not going to go kill people, you're perfectly reasonable for doing so, because these people genuinely believe that they're not killing people. And so the biblical mandate to execute murderers wouldn't apply to them as long as they genuinely believe that. And then if you say, well, let's just make a war to stop this, well, the problem is it's just going to be you running into Nazi Germany with a pocket knife, which is basically what these guys are. You know, they don't really accomplish anything. They might kill one guy. It doesn't really do anything. So you've got to raise an army to do that. But the issue is that if you raise such an army, you could democratically end abortion anyway, because that, you know, it would be an army of your fellow Americans, right? So anyway, hope this video made some sense. Thank you for your time.